I'll try to upload to my own drive.
And are the lights okay? Can we make it a little darker? I think that it'll show up better.
We can control the. It's pretty old-fashioned.
Right. It's okay if we can't. It just means, I think the people online can see it okay, just for the three of you. All right, so island plant functional syndromes and competition. So let's see here, how do we go forward? Yeah, so this is my first time. I don't know how to get this off the top. Do you?
Yeah, we can't see that online, so it should be fine.
But you can't see the title.
Yeah.
Oh, well. Maybe, okay. So this is my first time to New Zealand. I'm very excited to be here, just for a week this time, but next year I'll be coming back for a sabbatical. Kate McKinnison and I are starting some new research exploring how heteroblasty potentially could constrain climate change tolerance due to these sort of dramatic shifts in form and function as plants grow up. Which are thought to have evolved in response to predictable changes in environments as plants grow up, but are perhaps becoming less predictable with climate change. So that's sort of on the horizon, but we're not there yet. So I have no data to share in that regard. So instead, I'm going to be focusing on some of the island plant syndrome research we've been doing. So of course, as you all are well aware, being on an island yourself, there are thousands of islands. And so the question is whether the plants and the biodiversity that develops on islands is potentially quite different from, and in predictable ways different from, that of continental plants. So despite being super small, islands are really important because they harbor a lot of biodiversity, both with respect to biological diversity, but also human diversity in terms of language and nationalities. And this is disproportionate to their land area, right? So they're home to a really dramatic and unique biodiversity as a consequence of high rates of endemicity. They're also among the most threatened ecosystems and habitats in the world, with disproportionate rates of species endangerment and extinction. So this biodiversity is at risk, and so therefore important and useful to try to understand the characteristics of this biodiversity. So as a consequence of the high rates of endemicity and the ways that biotas develop on islands, the taxonomic biodiversity is often really unique. And that's the consequence of dispersal barriers, which prevent some types of organisms from colonizing islands, and then the subsequent adaptive variations that the organisms undergo that do colonize islands. And the result of this is that some groups are underrepresented on islands compared to continents, while other groups are overrepresented, leading to this clear biotic disharmony. So for example, in Hawaii, we have only 2 terrestrial mammalian species. These are 2 species of bats. But on the other hand, from a single dispersal event, we have 125 species of lobeliads as an example for plants. For insects, we only have 2 native butterfly species, but over 1,000 species of Drosophila. So this is a really interesting biotic disharmony compared to continental biotas. In addition to this taxonomic biodiversity, it's also been suggested that there's unique phenotypic diversity on islands. And this for plants is usually referred to as the plant syndrome, the island plant syndrome. And the idea here is that island plants have evolved convergently on a suite of characteristics in response to shared environmental conditions that islands have. So for example, these are mild seasonality and mild temperatures because of the buffering effect of water, lots of high wind speeds, and the directionality of that wind can lead to orographic rainfall, relatively few disturbances compared to comparable continental environments. And all of this is thought to have convergently selected for suites of plant traits that we can recognize as the island plant syndrome. And these features include things like being poorly defended against herbivores because of that biotic disharmony and the absence of some herbivore guilds, low fire tolerance, limited seed dispersal, some reproductive traits as a consequence of small population sizes, and relatively depauperate pollinator communities such as self-compatibility, generalized floral morphology. The mild climates is thought to have selected for a lot of secondary woodiness, and low species richness thought to have selected for slow growing resource use strategies. If you haven't read this book, Evolution in Isolation by Casey Burns, I highly recommend it. It's a really nice discussion of all of these different features that we think characterize island plants and the evidence that favors or does not favor them. And I've underlined the ones that my lab's been investigating. So we've explored a number of these predictions. The one I'm going to focus mostly on today is the slow growing prediction. But first, I want to emphasize, if you turn that book to the side, you see it's quite narrow. It's a very small book. And I think that reflects the very limited evidence we have for any of these island plant syndrome predictions. So I would say, despite the fact that we often describe plants with these traits as if it's already a done deal, in fact, we have very limited evidence for them. They're still at the stage of being a prediction and not at all a well-developed syndrome quite yet. All right. So the island plant syndrome prediction that island plants are slow growing actually stems from observations about invasive plants. So clearly we have a lot of invasive plants established on islands, and we also clearly have high rates of native plant declines. And the co-occurrence of these two things, the decline of native island plants and the abundance and spread of invasive plants, has led to the idea that those invasive plants are simply outcompeting the island plants and leading to their displacement. And this is used as evidence for the idea that island plants are weak competitors as a consequence of being slow growing and conservative in their resource use. However, if you try to get into the mechanisms of this, it actually gets a little more complicated. So here's this kind of logic chain that leads to this idea. So at first, islands have low species richness. In general, for plants, this is the case. For comparable land areas, islands do tend to have lower species richness than continental areas. That then is thought to have led to the availability of empty niche space because of that low species richness, and that those unfilled niches then have resulted in weak competition among the island plants, because if there were strong competition, they would have filled all of that niche space. That weak competition that we then expect among island plant communities is thought to have led to the evolution of sort of slow resource use, slow growing, competitively weak strategies, which then makes them vulnerable to fast growing, vigorous invasive plants when they establish an island. And that then explains why native plants often go extinct or become less abundant when invasive plants become established. That's the logic chain that people use to explain this. And there's a lot of assumptions here, and many assumptions not well supported. But there's sort of two main things happening here, which are actually contradictory to each other. The first is undoubtedly well documented. Islands do tend to have lower species richness. And we also know that invasive plants are well established and native plants are becoming less abundant and going extinct. Those two things are well documented. The mechanisms that get us there are not clear. And actually, we have these two opposite predictions. The empty niche idea is actually that continental plants establish because there are empty niches and they therefore avoid competition with the native plants. That's what an empty niche allows, the occupation of a niche without competition. So by that idea, we would expect no competition between the continental plants and the native island plants. On the other hand, it's often discussed as the continental invasive plants are vigorously outcompeting the native island plants. That's different altogether. That's that competition is really driving this interaction. So these are the sort of two main ideas that I think we're implicitly assuming is going on. But let's take a look at the evidence for these. So Darwin's naturalization hypothesis can help us out here because this relates directly. So Darwin's naturalization hypothesis is the idea that invasive plants are more likely to successfully establish in places where they're not closely related to the native species already present. And by being unrelated, we assume that they're functionally different and therefore encounter very little biotic resistance. So weak competition from the natives, and that allows them to establish into empty niches. That's the empty niche hypothesis. On the other hand, it's been acknowledged that it's not just about biotic interactions, whether continental plants or invasive species in general can be established, because the environment also plays a role. So the conundrum here is that continental plants or invasive plants are more likely to establish in places where they're related to the native species, because that suggests that they're already pre-adapted to the environmental stressors of a place and therefore can tolerate the climatic or soil or other abiotic conditions. So there's the conundrum. The invasive plants are most likely to establish in places where they're similar enough to be pre-adapted, but not so similar to encounter strong competitive resistance by the native species. Yes? So this is the sort of two hypotheses in one idea. And Darwin's naturalization hypothesis, or conundrum as it's more commonly referred to these days, is not specific to islands. People have investigated this in lots of continental systems as well. And usually it's done by looking at the phylogenetic relatedness between invasive and native plants or other organisms, assuming that the phylogenetic relatedness informs us about potential niche overlap and competition, which I think is a pretty big assumption. For islands, we recently reviewed the evidence for this and found that it's totally mixed. It's sort of equal amounts of studies have found that invasive plants are phylogenetically more similar than expected by chance or less similar than expected by chance to the native species on islands. And so on islands, there's clearly no strong evidence for this Darwin's naturalization hypothesis. And I think one of the big issues is that phylogenetic relatedness may not predict niche overlap and competition for island and continental plants, which we assume or predict to be functionally very different as a consequence of these different environments that they're evolving under. So I think rather than using phylogenetic relatedness as a proxy for trying to make some conclusions about the likelihood of competition, we should look at competition more directly, right? And resource use to try to better understand the role of competition between native and invasive plants on islands as a way of trying to investigate this prediction that island plants are conservative and slow growing. So if we look at the direct evidence for that, the most commonly used direct evidence for competition is demographic data collected in the context of natural communities. And we can then calculate the effect of neighbors on focal plant growth and vice versa. And that's a way of inferring the competition intensity between neighboring plants in a community. That's the way it's typically done. We don't have any of this kind of data for islands. So demographic data are really rare. And especially in this community context that allows us to disentangle things like distance, density, size. So we really aren't able to assess this kind of direct evidence, which is sort of the gold standard for examining competition intensity. Pairwise experimental tests are also really commonly used to calculate the intensity of competition between neighbors, especially if you're interested in particular identities of plants and their effects of competition on neighbor growth. And just as an example, there was a really nice meta-analysis in 2016 where they compiled all of this experimental data, 1,241 effect sizes, looking at the magnitude of effect of neighbors on focal plant growth and whether that depended on the identity of the focal plant and the neighbor. And what they found, interestingly, is that identity really matters. So invasive neighbors strongly suppress native plant focal growth, but not vice versa. So native plants do not suppress the growth of focal invasive plants, indicating that invasive plants are really sort of better at competing than the native plants. And this is a global meta-analysis. So this includes evidence from lots of different places. And actually wasn't particular to islands, but we saw this and we thought, well, this would be a great resource for seeing if the magnitude of this effect is even stronger for native island plants, as we would predict if island plants are particularly weak competitors, even more so than native continental plants.
Can I just ask a question? Are these mostly field experiments or
both? Field experiments, glasshouse experiments, all kinds, but experimental approaches usually, mostly, yes. So we downloaded the data set. Of those 1,241 effect sizes, 62 were from islands, so enough to work with. The effect size they use is Hedges D, which is a magnitude of the difference in growth for the focal plant without a neighbor versus with an invasive plant or some other plant competitor. A negative Hedges D indicates that the plant grew smaller in the presence of a neighbor. That's consistent with competition. If it was a positive Hedges D, that would indicate that the plant actually grew better when there was a neighbor than without a neighbor, consistent with facilitation. So what we found is that across the whole data set, it did seem as though the effect of a neighbor was stronger for island plants than continental plants, as we might predict. So that's the top panel there. But when we tried to investigate the identity component, we found that this stronger effect on islands is actually driven by native competition. So it occurred when it was a native competitor suppressing a focal plant growth. That's where we see the strong intensity of competition. And that was marginally significantly stronger than native competition in continental plants. We couldn't actually test whether invasive plants suppress native plants more on islands and continents because there's not a single example of one of these experiments where an invasive plant was paired with a native plant on islands. Among all of those 62, it was only native or non-native competition. So clearly a major knowledge gap. We simply don't know what the intensity of competition is between invasive and native plants on islands. Those are the two most commonly used direct approaches for measuring competition intensity, but it's becoming increasingly common to use traits as indicators of resource use and to use these kinds of indirect comparisons of functional trait analyses to get at whether we expect that to translate into growth effects and competition intensity. So very commonly people use leaf economic spectrum traits. So these are traits that are involved in photosynthesis and return on investment of leaf tissues. And this is thought to then correspond to sort of the growth vigor of the plants. And therefore we infer could indicate the likelihood of competition intensity. So in general, in the context of invasion, what we predict is that invasive plants are more acquisitive, consistent with this sort of high rate of photosynthesis, but quick turnover in tissues, so for vigorous growth. And that native plants would have more of a conservative leaf economic spectrum strategy where they invest in longer lived tissues, slower rates of photosynthesis, and that could then correspond to sort of a more conservative slow growth strategy. That's our prediction. That's actually been quite well supported in lots of studies done on continents. We've been examining this in Hawaii on woody plant species. So our question was really straightforward. Are native Hawaiian plants more conservative in their leaf economic spectrum traits than the invasive plants established there, as a way of sort of indirectly trying to explore the likely intensity of competition? And the Hawaiian flora is a really great place to do this kind of examination because we have a lot of understanding of the native species and which species are invasive and how long they've been there. About 90% of our angiosperms are endemic, so we have really high rates of endemicity. We have, at current estimates, about 1,500 native species that diversified from 259 colonists. So this is always sort of adjusting as people do more molecular studies, but about 1,500 species and about the same number of naturalized invasive species out in natural areas. So there's many other non-native species that are planted horticulturally, but we wouldn't call naturalized. So there's about 50% of the flora in natural areas are not native. There's also a long history of the Hawaiian indigenous knowledge of these plants. And so we have a really great understanding of their ecology and the sort of ecosystem function of these native ecosystems. So people have done lots of great functional trait work on the Hawaiian flora for various reasons. So we're really expanding on previous work, but we're trying to do this in a much more comparative, broad sense. So we included a lot of species, 87 woody species, 55 native, 32 non-native. A lot of the previous work focused on the youngest island, Hawaii Island, but we did most of our sampling on Oahu, because that's where I live. But we also did sample on Hawaii, Maui, Kauai. So we have the 4 main islands represented. And importantly, we really wanted to focus on the scale and the elevational gradients. So depending on how you're making these comparisons between native and invasive plants, it really matters the scale, because a lot of times what we have is that at low elevations, there's much more abundance and diversity of non-native species than at high elevations. And if we sample them at just those places, the environmental conditions are also really different. So we might expect more conservative growth strategies at high elevation because of those environmental constraints. But that wouldn't have any bearing on competition because the plants aren't actually co-occurring. So we have to be really careful about this species sorting across space and make sure that we're doing these native invasive comparisons at the scale at which competition occurs, which means at the local scale. So this is often done at the archipelago scale, and we wanted to take into account the species sorting, so we did it at the local scale, but across the archipelago and across environmental gradients. So we did capture these elevational gradients that we know matter for resource use and likely intensity of competition, but we only sampled plants at where they co-occur, where we could sample native and invasive together, and we're making that comparison at that local scale. So across this elevational gradient, we do capture a lot of climate variability. So 400 to 5,600 millimeter mean annual rainfall gradient. This is a really dramatic rainfall gradient, and a 10 to 24 degrees mean annual temperature gradient. So these are really different environments that we're capturing. And just as an aside, we've actually done all this work to see if it matters the scale. So we've done the comparisons at the local scale, at the island scale, at the archipelago scale, and also at the species scale, or incorporating intraspecific trait variation, and it really matters. So we've found that the conclusions we draw from these kinds of comparisons are totally different depending on the scale and whether we incorporate intraspecific trait variation, which means that we need to be careful of that. And that's just currently in review right now. So this was a huge team effort. It was wonderful to spend all this time in the field, sampling all of these trees and all of these amazing environments. I had a fabulous postdoc, Andrea Westerband, who was the team leader for this. And we had these three fantastic graduate students, Tiffany, Kari, and Kealoha, who spent a lot of time out in the field, climbing trees and going through streams and doing all kinds of stuff. Plus a lot of fabulous undergraduate students and visiting graduate students from other universities. So doing this kind of trait analysis is a lot of work in the field, and it's also a lot of work in the lab when you bring the samples back and we're processing them. So really, this could not have been possible without so many fabulous and really passionate botanical students. So we were focusing on the leaf economic spectrum traits because we have this prediction that they directly inform us about growth vigor, and therefore we hope that can inform us about competition. So these are the ones I'm going to share with you today. We actually have about 20 other traits, which are, I'm not going to share with you right now, but these are the sort of classic leaf economic spectrum traits. And of course, the predictions going from the acquisitive end, which is what we expect to see for the invasive plants, over to the conservative side for the native plants. And we don't expect each of these traits to be operating separately, right? So these co-function as part of the leaf economic spectrum. So all of our analyses are multivariate. So I'm showing you the predictions for each trait, but in reality, all of our analyses are multivariate. And here we go. So we analyze this with a redundancy analysis, which is like a PCA, but it includes a constraining axis because we wanted to test specifically whether invasive and native plants separate in this multivariate trait space. So that's our redundant axis. And it's a little hard to see with this coloring, the sort of like blue circle and the blue dots are the invasive plants, and the black dots and the black circle are the native plants. And the main conclusion is there's a ton of trait overlap, right? I mean, invasive and natives are occupying the same multivariate trait space, and there's a lot of this trait space. We do detect a statistically significant separation with the redundancy analysis. I'm showing you the statistical test there, and you can see they do separate just a little bit along this axis. And it is in the direction that we predict, more conservative for the natives, more acquisitive for the invasives, but that explains a very small proportion of the variance, right? 2%, yeah. So this is one of those cases where it's statistically significant, but probably not biologically meaningful, yeah.
The graph is a huge sample size.
Yeah. Same if we do species means, yeah. Even doing like hurdles so that we can account for differences in sample sizes, same, yeah. Also, there's a ton of variation in these traits. So it doesn't seem likely that there's empty niches because the island plants are occupying a lot of trait space. So what we're showing you here is our ranges for these 4 traits with respect to that original leaf economic spectrum data set, which is the GlophNet data set, which we can access. And for LMA, we have among our native plants 64% of that global range. For photosynthesis, 100% of the global range. For nitrogen, 87%. And actually, phosphorus content among our plants exceeds the extent of what's reported in GlophNet. So these are island plants that are really functionally different, even though it's relatively few species. So functionally, they're extremely variable. For us in Hawaii, this isn't that surprising because we sampled across this huge environmental gradient, right? So it makes a lot of sense that the traits are going to vary dramatically across all this environmental heterogeneity. The important thing is that that variation matters for the intensity of competition across space, right? So we can't generalize easily across space because the functional traits are varying quite a lot. And it turns out the differences between natives and invasives shift across space. So I wanted to get into that in a little bit more detail. All this huge amount of trait variation is linked clearly to the environment and to climate in particular. It's also clearly linked to soils, which we're currently working on. But the climate piece we've already finished, so I'm going to share that today. For Hawaii, we have really great statistically downscaled and spatially interpolated climate data. And this is specific. There's people really working on this hard because we have really steep environmental gradients. So to try to characterize that, there's really great climate data. So this is all available in the Climate Atlas of Hawaii. You can download lots of climate data. We downloaded actually about 45 climate variables and then reduced them to the ones that really mattered for understanding the variation across our sites. And all of these we put into a PCA and we come up with 2 axes that really explain a lot of the variability among our 45 field sites. And these we're calling the moisture axis and the solar energy axis. So the moisture axis correlates best with soil moisture and humidity. And the solar energy axis correlates best with air temperature and potential evapotranspiration. So those are the 2 that we then put into models with all of our trait data to try to understand how does climate relate to trait function, and can that help us understand potential differences or detect differences between the native and invasive plants. So I'm showing you just one example here. This is the solar energy axis, and that's photosynthetic rate. And what you can see, interestingly, is that the patterns of how photosynthesis shifts as solar energy increases is different between natives and invasive plants. So for the natives, what we see is that there's this increase in photosynthesis as sites get hotter and drier, well, hotter, and that we see almost no shift for the invasive plants. And that this then leads to a reversal in the kind of trait differences. So at low energy sites, we have that the invasives have higher rates of photosynthesis, which we could then say maybe predicts competition intensity. For the invasives outcompeting the natives, but in these high solar energy or low solar energy sites, we see the opposite pattern. So basically, this comes down to cooler sites, the invasives are more acquisitive, hotter sites, the natives seem more acquisitive, and they converge on similar strategies in mild climates. If we do this across all of our traits, and with respect to both of those axes, what we can conclude is that invasives tend to be more acquisitive in the wetter and cooler sites, and that natives tend to be more acquisitive in the arid and hotter sites, and that they, like I said, converge in these mild climates. And so this likely implies or could suggest that the intensity of competition, if it was driven by leaf economic spectrum trait strategies, would also shift across the landscape. All right. So if we take this back to the context that I started with about the empty niche and the vigorous competition, with our data set in Hawaii, we would say that we have no evidence of empty niche. There's a ton of trait diversity and a lot of trait overlap, and that it doesn't seem clear that the invasives might be outcompeting the natives through more acquisitive leaf economic spectrum strategies, that those differences are contingent on environment and in complex ways. So we don't seem to have a lot of strong evidence for this island plant syndrome prediction that island plants are generally more conservative and slow growing. But I think there's probably a few other things that might be going on. So one thing is that it's oversimplifying to predict that there's any one factor driving native plant declines, right? So a lot of times we do focus on invasive plant competition as being the primary driver of native plant declines, but in reality, there's many simultaneous threats, and they probably have really strong non-additivities. So we need to include competition with other simultaneous threats to investigate this. And we're not doing that in this particular study, although we have considered this in some other things. So it's not just competition, but could also be climate change, invasive animals, invasive diseases, habitat fragmentation, et cetera. Second, we focused on adult plants that were already established in these communities, but actually I suspect that seedling competition is maybe where most of the displacement is happening. And this stems from field studies on Big Island primarily, where they're finding that grasses really prevent native plant seedling recruitment. So in the forest, there's not a lot of grasses. It's not clear how informative that is. Nonetheless, it seems like the seedling recruitment stage is where a lot of the action is in terms of these potential displacement opportunities. And we're aware of this. I really like focusing on seedlings. So we actually, concurrent with that field study, collected seeds and grew plants up and measured the same kind of traits for 43 of them. So we have similar kinds of data that we can compare between the native invasives at the seedling stage, but we haven't yet done that. Finally, I actually think we got on a tangent with the invasion piece, right? So it's because this whole idea stems from observations of invasive plants displacing native plants on islands. But island plant syndromes are really supposed to be about island plants being fundamentally different from continental plants. That's a different question from native invasive plant comparisons. And I think this is really important because invasive plants are not a random subset of continental plants, right? There's lots of evidence that invasive plants are more acquisitive than native continental plants. So detecting, if we had detected that invasive plants are more acquisitive than native island plants, is not evidence that island plants have a slow growing conservative resource use strategy as part of island plant syndrome, right? Because we're biasing our approach, we're confounding origin with invasion. So I think a much better comparison would be to compare native island plants to native continental plants, plants that aren't invasive. That's really what the island plant syndrome is meant to be about. So that's what we're doing now. And this is part of a big global synthesis that I'm collaborating with Claire Fortunel on at AMAP in Montpellier, France. So we're synthesizing island plant functional traits, resource use functional traits, so that we can characterize functional diversity of island plants globally. And so we can then compare them to non-invasive continental plants sampled on continental systems. That to me is the best test of the island plant syndrome predictions. So this is in progress right now. We have about 14,588 data points in the database so far. Our scope is global, but we're focusing on proper oceanic islands, so not other insular systems that are island-like. And sort of as a consequence of the observation in Hawaii that the climate and environmental heterogeneity is really key for understanding functional diversity, our goal is to have this be geospatial so that we can incorporate the local conditions where the traits were measured as another way of getting at this island plant resource use. So not just kind of like island as the only factor, but also what's the climate and the soil like of those islands, and other island features like area and distance to continents. Also, we've observed that intraspecific trait variation can be dramatic, and for island plants, perhaps in particular, because a lot of these lineages are very young. So they have a lot of intraspecific trait variation that may eventually correspond to speciation, but hasn't yet. And so ignoring that for island plants is particularly problematic, I would say. We've captured quite a lot of diversity already. So we have 1,421 plant species in our database from 158 plant families. So there's a lot of different plants we've already got. Where we see it, we're taking data on invasive species, but like I said, that's not our real focus. It's really the native island plants compared to the native continental plants. And we're really just getting started, only 16% so far through our data extraction. We're capturing a lot of diversity geographically, but there's still so many islands not well represented, right? That first figure, thousands of islands, so we're barely even there. And probably many islands don't have these traits data collected or available. And this is something that's really tricky, and we're trying to work with local scientists and, of course, be very mindful of data sovereignty as we're putting this together. There's also major biases in the traits that are represented. So some traits are really overrepresented, like leaf mass per area. You can't see that there. It's high though. I wish I could see it. Max height and wood density. So together, those three account for about half of the traits in the database. And then there's many other traits that we have just in low representation. But we're taking everything sort of physiological and anatomical that's directly related to resource use. So one of my favorite kinds of traits is leaf anatomy, and those are very poorly represented so far in the database. So our first goal is to characterize the resource use trait space of island plants. So this gets at the idea of empty niches. So are there empty niches among island floras? We can do this statistically by modeling the trait space and looking for places in the multivariate trait space that are empty, right? This can also help us investigate things like functional syndromes, trait coordination and modularity, multifunctionality among traits with respect to different kinds of functions, light, water, mineral, stress, and specifically trying to characterize functional resource use trait space with respect to island features like climate, island age, island area, etc. That's our first goal, is just to focus on the island plants and characterize their resource use trait space. Then we want to compare the island plant trait space to continental resource use trait space to see if island plants are a subset of continental plants, as we might expect again for empty niche hypotheses, or whether they kind of capture the same extent of functional trait diversity as continental plants. And that's also how we can then test this idea, the plant syndrome prediction, that island plants are more conservative in their resource use than continental plants. And then this is just always with synthesis, it's a move towards more data collection, right? So we're identifying data gaps, places where we don't have much data, traits that aren't well represented, organs that aren't well represented, root traits are really underrepresented, and sort of be moving forward with filling those gaps, but in a very mindful way that avoids helicopter science or any issues with data sovereignty. And that's kind of where we hope this leads eventually, is to some sort of network of island scientists who are collecting these kinds of traits in similar ways for island plants, so we can get a really robust synthesis and characterization of island plants, but led by local scientists. So avoiding the kind of colonialism that's sort of impacted island science for so long. That's where we hope this goes eventually. And so for that, I'll thank you for your attention and take any questions. Sorry, that was an extra slide I took out and put at the end there. Should I see if there are any questions on Zoom?
surprised to hear the term disharmonic. But it's like, I used that from New Zealand flora in a paper years ago in a review of texture analysis.
That it's a what?
That it's an outmoded.
Oh.
I think I know who it was.
Oh, in Hawaii, we use it all the time. We have a very disharmonic biota.
It was pretty disharmonic. I know quite.
What's the problem with it?
No, I'm really anxious. Sorry.
What would be the problem with it?
I can't. It sounds like it, I suppose it's a modernist way of viewing it.
Oh, well, I would need a little bit more like rationale for that, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, Charles.
Hey, Casey, this is a very interesting talk. I love that you had a really hypothesis-driven approach to the investigation, which I find really helpful in terms of understanding the work. And although I was quite intrigued because, you know, the way the hypothesis was set up, it doesn't actually interrogate one scenario, which is that both are true, right? And so I think, you know, when you talk about the island syndrome, it sort of implicitly says that, you know, it's got to be this one over-encompassing universal pathway. But of course, biology, you know, I always tell students that evolution doesn't select for what's elegant or what's ideal. Evolution selects for what barely works, right? And so what do you think of that idea that perhaps there isn't one grand unifying theory?
One, if I hear you correctly, what do I think about there not being one hypothesis to explain this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that that's a very likely scenario. In my opinion, the idea for island plant syndromes is way too simplistic for exactly what you're suggesting. There are many different functional solutions and too much heterogeneity within and among islands to possibly expect that convergent evolution has occurred across island floras. To me, that seems exceedingly unlikely, which is why I suspect we're kind of in the situation right now where the more people start collecting data on these predictions, the more we're deciding that they don't actually apply. And a great example of that is anti-herbivore defenses is one of these classic island plant syndrome predictions. The last two meta-analyses to be published on this in the last few years are like, no, we have no evidence for this. There are, of course, many island plants that are well defended and just lots of diversity within island floras. So I think hypotheses are really useful to frame a study, but almost always when we're trying to deal with really big questions in a broad geographic scope, it's never going to come down to one answer. Exactly as you imply. Yes.
You're comparing the native plants to native island plants to native plants on a continent. How are you going to select comparable plants?
Yeah. I mean, so we've talked about this a lot because there's the phylogenetic component of relatedness. There's also, are we sampling in sort of comparable places in terms of their climate and et cetera? And the island plant syndrome prediction is that despite any of that, island plants are fundamentally different. Despite different environments, despite being phylogenetically related or unrelated, convergently, they've evolved down a different path. So theoretically, we shouldn't need to worry about that, right? Nonetheless, of course, we have a phylogenetic structure in our models, so we can at least account for some of that evolutionary history. And we're purposely collecting the environmental data, so we can again include that. The real tangle, I think, is the continental sources of data are often not geospatial. Most of TRI is not geospatial. So actually capturing the climate or environmental factors of the comparative continental floras is going to be much harder because we're doing it from the beginning for the island plants. It's going to be hard because we've started trying to compile this to find it for the continental trait data. And I think it's because people have just not been databasing those features the way now I wish they would. But theoretically, we shouldn't need to worry about that.
Are you using the Austrite database? That is.
Yeah. Yeah, we have that on our minds. Yep. Yep. No, because we're still like building the island one. I'm a little nervous about the continental comparisons. Like I'm most interested in characterizing island plant functional diversity. The continental comparison for these reasons is like way harder, I think. So I've just set it aside for now.
Austrites has got.
Yeah. I did see that.
Tasmania reports have been intermittently connected to the main listings, not as island as some, not as island as Hawaii.
Yeah, most islands aren't as island as Hawaii. So we are, this is why like proximity, and even now we're talking about history of like, you know, paleo history, when were they connected, things like this, because that's true for other islands too, like Madagascar, that we're treating as an island. It's not the same kind of island.
During like a period that's connected to it.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is like, this is again why to me island plant syndrome is too simple, because islands are themselves really variable and have really variable histories. So why would we expect them to all be the same? Of course, they're not the same.
Can you explain the hot dry editedness of Hawaiian island plants? Some work of history and the nature of the island and the volcanic substrate that they colonize.
Well, that's the other thing. The assumption that low diversity corresponds to low competition intensity completely overlooks density compensation, right? And you can get huge abundances of within species organisms that then leads to really intense competition. And also with low diversity, there's more likelihood for species to co-occur in a predictable way to then allow for the evolution of distinct strategies to minimize competition. So some people have made the opposite prediction that in low species richness communities, you should expect competition intensity to have led to disparate functions because of this high likelihood of co-occurring. So when I look at the landscape in Hawaii, it's super dense. I just assume, of course, the plants are competing.
Now, but when, you know, an island first formed, it's a sort of bare substrate and then the initial colonists. So.
Yeah, but it's been like 20 million years, right? So like the bare substrate, yeah, those populations are young, but on the old islands, no, those are old. And they're migrating and colonizing the new young islands. It's not like a species starting brand new there all the time. And so, yeah. So I think you're probably right. When you go to like a very young lava substrate, the plant density is low and maybe the competition is weak, but very close to that are old kipukas, and just a tiny skip away is an island with a very old substrate. So I don't know. On the landscape scale, for sure, competition is definitely reasonable. Yeah. Are there any other questions on here? No. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.